that was essentially indefensible. So consolidate your position within society, and then from that, the positions of strength you had gained, be able to start working outwards to bring in the more vulnerable. In the machine trades, this in fact did happen. And the strike wave of 1919, which we'll get to, I think after the midterm, if I remember correctly, was largely over the issue of extending trade union representation to unskilled workers. And in each of the major strikes of 1919, the specific issue that prompted the strike was unionization and representation of workers of color. Japanese workers in the Seattle shipyards, African American steel workers in Birmingham, Alabama, and Mexican workers in Texas. So at least for some of the unions, this was not merely rhetoric, though it was probably mostly rhetoric. And when push came to shove, when they felt they had the opportunity to expand in 1919, when they felt they had the opportunity to expand unionization, they embarked on a campaign which led to the biggest strike wave of strikes in U.S. history, and the second most violent set of strikes since after the 1877 railroad strike. And the trade unions were smashed in the course of doing that. So those who felt that organizing the vulnerable was a risky business were vindicated. But at this time, the idea was organize those who cannot be fired and slowly reach out to the more vulnerable. And that the AFL should be based on strong, disciplined organizations, that high dues were needed, officers had to be paid well, and strike funds had to be accumulated so that would allow unions to support members for long periods of time. Strikes, you would go out on a strike when you could support your members for up to a year. So that required money in the bank. And again, the skilled workers were the people who had the money. If they could give $2 a week out of their salary to the unions, and the unions could become a major economic force themselves and also have the funds that would allow them to go out and organize and to conduct strikes if they needed to. Unions, they also argued, should provide the basic health and death benefits for workers, thus securing the loyalty of their members. Not the fraternal organization, not the church, but the trade unions. And the trade unions could do this slightly cheaper, and not the employer. And then you would focus fights not on abstract ideas about producer society, but on attainable goals, higher wages, shorter hours, work rules that curtailed managerial authority. And the 8-hour day became the central national issue that the AFL embraced. Though wages and benefits were typically the issues in local disputes. Historians, however, who've looked closely at the strikes, particularly the bigger strikes of the period 1880 to 1930, have concluded that largely money was not the issue. It was control over work rules. It was health and safety. Now, when I say money wasn't the issue, that doesn't mean it wasn't, because in some degrees money is always the issue. Workers want more money, employers want to pay less, but the employers were willing to pay a relatively high set of wages. But in exchange, what they wanted was absolute control over the workplace, and the unions were particularly found it particularly important to contest the management control over the production process, because that they felt that was being organized in a way that was killing and maiming the members of the union. And finally, instead of forming the AFL renounced any efforts to form an independent labor party, and instead said it would work with both existing political parties, and it would support any politician who worked for pro-labor legislation. So this is a cartoon from, I forget which election, but somewhat later. I think it must be 1908, in which William Howard Taft and William Jennings Bryan are both courting the labor vote. Now, Gomper's strategy was very successful. With each victory, the AFL grew in membership and funds, and they always wanted everybody to know how much money they had. And they became able to engage in more protracted struggles. They were also able to count on a range of elected and appointed officials who would support them, both Republicans and Democrats. The strategy that the AFL chose meant that a large majority of workers would remain outside trade unions. Now, the number varied from state to state, but nationally in 1900, only 1 out of 10 workers was a member of a trade union. Now, if you were in the Northwest or the Midwest or on the Pacific Coast, the number was considerably higher than that. If you were in the South or the Great Plains, the number was considerably lower than that. Now, and while Gomper spoke out actively and loudly against racial and sexual prejudice and opposed segregated unions, he accepted the right of unions as democratic organizations to exclude members on the basis of race or gender. And race or national background became a predictor of whether a worker was in a formal trade union or not. Most immigrants were not, and only a tiny minority of African American or Latino or Asian workers were unionized. The AFL spoke as if it would be one day become the home for all employed workers in the United States, but it never even came close. And racial division emerged during these years, from 1886 on, as the clearest block to organizing all workers. And Gompers was well aware of this, but he felt powerless to deal with the growing role of race in the organization of U.S. society. As a realist, he accepted that little could be done against a racial ideology pervading the entire country, which we're going to address on Monday. The other sort of issue that divided the labor movement at this time was between craft unionism and industrial unionism, so a technical term. So craft unions are unions based on a particular skill. So all carpenters belong to one union, stonemasons belong to a second union, laborers belong to a third union, electricians belong to a fourth union, plumbers belong to a fifth union. They all may be working on the same building site, building the same building, but they belong to 5 separate unions, each of which is negotiating independently with the employer. In a factory, the skilled workers would be the machine workers, the painters, the metal trades workers, and each of them belonged to a separate union, each of them negotiating with the employer independently of each other. And in that case, the majority of the workers in a factory would be the semi-skilled and unskilled would be ununionized. Now, the division had a practical purpose to it, because you could have one union advance something, and the employer balks at it, and then the union walks off the job, calls a strike. The other unions say, what can we do? They're their own bosses. They decide what's best for them. We have to honor the picket line. So then that's settled. And then the second union comes forward and says, well, this is what's bothering us. You granted that first union some more money, so you got to give us more money. Plus, we insist on greater control over how many, we want more rest time, for example. And then they go out on strike. And then everybody says, Elf says, well, what can we do? So it had it was like, killing the bosses with 1,000 cuts strategy. And was very effective. But it meant that small groups of workers were dealing with the employer at a time, and the mass of workers were unrepresented. There was an alternative strategy, which is that everybody working for a given employer should be in the same union. And the various trades and tasks are represented, and that union would speak with one voice. This was an idea that was tried out most dramatically at the Pullman factory in 1894. The railroad workers which was the Railroad Workers Union, American Railroad Workers Union, ARU, had formed a couple of years earlier as an amalgamation of the various railroad crafts unions, the locomotive, the conductors, the firemen, and so forth. And then they took over the contracts with the Pullman Company. So here was a single union facing a single employer. Now, in 1893, there was a major depression, actually greater than the economic historians now think was probably greater than the Great Depression of the 1930s. And George Pullman, who was a welfare capitalist, said he wouldn't lay off his workers, but he was going to cut their wages. But he was also giving them housing. And he said, oh, but the real estate market hasn't changed, so I'm cutting your wages in half, but I'm not going to lower your rents. So the union said, no, this is impossible. We insist that you lower the rents for the duration of the period that the wages are lowered. And Pullman said, no, this is not possible. It's two separate issues. There's the labor market, there's a housing market. I'm not going to compromise. So the workers went out on strike. All the crafts.